My name is Imogen Holcombe. I am 38 years old. And the morning of my husband's funeral, before the priest had arrived, before the cars had begun to line the gravel drive of the Holcombe family house in Camden, Maine, before anyone in the family had spoken to me about anything other than the catering and the flowers and the specific careful logistics of a death in a family that had been preparing for the death for 11 months, my mother-in-law Vivian came into the kitchen where I was making coffee, closed the door behind her, and said one sentence to me that I have thought about every single day since. She said, "Imogen, we need to talk about the house." I was 37 years old that morning. I had been a widow for 4 days. My husband Bennett had died on a Wednesday afternoon in October, in the hospital bed we had set up in the front room of the house we had bought together 6 years earlier, with my hand in his and the late afternoon light coming through the window that faced the harbour, and his mother in the kitchen on a phone call she had stepped out to take 17 minutes earlier and had not yet returned from. I was the one in the room. I was the one who had been in that room, and the rooms before it, for the entire 11 months of Bennett's illness. I had been the one who managed the medications. I had been the one who handled the insurance. I had been the one who slept on the cot beside the bed for the final 3 weeks. I had been the one who, on the morning of the day he died, had washed his face with a warm cloth because he had asked me to, and because his mother had said the warm cloth was making her uncomfortable to watch. I had been the wife. I had been the wife in a family where the role of wife had been understood, by the family, as a kind of starving position. A position that was useful during the difficult years. A position that could be dismissed, with a degree of polite efficiency, when the difficult years were over. I did not yet understand, at 37 years old, on the morning of my husband's funeral, that I was about to be dismissed. I understood it by the end of that conversation in the kitchen. I understood the full shape of it by the end of the week. I understood what I was going to do about it by the end of the month. But before I take you into that kitchen and into the conversation with my mother-in-law Vivian and into the 11 months that followed, I need you to do something for me. I need you to think about the family that you married into. The family that received you when you arrived as the new wife of one of their sons, or the new husband of one of their daughters, or the new partner of someone they had loved before they had ever known to love you. The family that smiled at the wedding. The family that included you in the holiday photographs. The family that, somewhere in the long quiet years that followed the wedding, communicated to you, in small careful ways that were never quite specific enough to address out loud, that you were not actually part of them. That you were married to one of them. But you were not, yourself, them. Think about that family. Stay with me. Because this story is about what happens when the family that received you as a starving position discovers, after the difficult years are over, that the starving position they had been using had been, the entire time, a person with her own arrangements. If you are new to this channel, welcome. My name is Imogen. This is Silent Will Stories. I tell stories about the rooms where most people did not know to look. If something in this story finds you tonight, drop one word in the comments. Drop your city. Drop the time. I read every single one in the early morning before the rest of the house wakes up. They tell me who I am sitting with at the kitchen table. Let me take you back. Not to the kitchen. Not to the funeral. Let me take you back 9 years, to a small bookshop on Bayview Street in Camden, Maine, on an afternoon in late September, where a woman who had recently moved to the town from Boston was looking for a particular edition of a Wallace Stevens book that she had been told by a previous customer might be available in the back room. The woman was me. The previous customer had not been Bennett. But Bennett was the man who emerged from the back room with the book in his hands and who handed it to me across the wooden counter of the bookshop with the specific hesitation of a man who had not, until that afternoon, been entirely sure whether he was going to ask the woman who had requested the book if she would like to have a coffee with him. He asked. I said yes. We had coffee at a place across the street called Blue Spruce. We talked for 2.5 hours. By the time we walked out of the coffee shop, the September light was doing the particular thing it does in coastal Maine in the late afternoon, the gold-going blue that I would, in the years that followed, come to understand as the specific signature light of my marriage. Bennett was 33 years old that day. I was 29. He had grown up in Camden in the family I would, 18 months later, marry into. He had moved to Boston after college and had worked there for a decade as a maritime insurance underwriter, and he had returned to Camden 2 years before our meeting in the bookshop because his father had died and his mother had asked him to come home, and he told me that afternoon, the kind of son who came home when his mother asked. I was a graphic designer. I was, more specifically, the founder and sole owner of a small design studio called Holcombe Studio, which I had named, after our marriage, after my husband's family, in the specific gesture of a young wife who had not yet learned that the gesture would later be misread as something other than what it was. I had built the studio in Boston before I met Bennett. I had built it patiently over 6 years. By the time I met Bennett at 29, I had 11 clients, 2 part-time employees, and a revenue stream that was, by the standards of an independent design studio, unremarkable but entirely sustainable. I had moved to Camden because Bennett had asked me to. I had not closed the studio. I had, instead, made the specific decision that women in my situation often make, which is the decision to maintain a professional life in parallel with the marriage, in the quiet awareness that the marriage might, at some point, require the professional life as a foundation that did not depend on the marriage for its continuation. I had not made the decision because I had distrusted Bennett. I had made the decision because I had distrusted everything except the studio. The studio was the thing I had built. The studio was the thing I controlled. The studio was the thing that, when I was 23 years old and broke and living in a converted attic in Cambridge, had been the only thing in my life that had been entirely mine. I had brought the studio with me to Maine. I had not brought it as a backup. I had brought it as a self. Now let me tell you about the Holcombe family, because the family is the architecture and the architecture is what makes everything else make sense. Bennett's father had been a man named Duncan Holcombe, who had inherited a small commercial fishing fleet from his own father and had grown the fleet, over 30 years, into one of the larger lobster operations on the mid-coast of Maine. Duncan had died of a heart attack at 62, 2 years before I met Bennett. He had left the business to be managed by Bennett's older brother, a man named Whitfield, who had been working for the company since he was 22 and who was, by the time of his father's death, the natural inheritor of the operational leadership. Duncan had also left, separately and specifically, the Holcombe family house. The house was the house I am telling you about. The house where my husband had grown up. The house where, eventually, Bennett and I had moved into the small carriage house on the property after our wedding, because Vivienne had asked us to, because she had not wanted to live in the main house alone, because the main house was, in Vivienne's words, a house meant for family. The house sat on 3 acres on a small inlet that fared into Penobscot Bay. The main house was a 4-bedroom shingle-style cottage that had been built in 1903 by Bennett's great-grandfather, a sea captain named Ezekiel Holcombe, who had returned from his last voyage with enough money to commission the architect Charles Elliott to design a summer house for his family that would, the captain had told the architect at the time, last for 100 years and produce 6 generations of children who would understand what it meant to wake up beside the water. The captain had been, in his estimation of the longevity of his house, modest. The house was now 122 years old. It had produced 5 generations of children. It was, by the standards of historic Maine coastal architecture, considered significant. It was on the National Register. It had been featured, twice, in regional architectural publications. It was worth, on the morning my mother-in-law came into the kitchen and closed the door, approximately $2.8 million. I did not know that on the morning she came into the kitchen. I would learn it 3 weeks later. Vivian Holcombe was 69 years old that morning. She had been beautiful in the way that certain women from old New England families were beautiful all their lives, the specific beauty that does not require much from the face and that becomes, with age, a kind of architecture in itself. She wore her white hair in the particular short, careful cut of women who had been having their hair done at the same place for 40 years. She wore a string of pearls. She wore a navy cashmere cardigan over a cream silk blouse. She wore the specific clothing of a woman who had been preparing, in the hours before her son's funeral, to look exactly the way a Holcombe widow was expected to look on the morning of a Holcombe funeral. She had not cried. I want to be careful when I say this, because the not crying is a thing I noticed at the time but did not understand until much later. Vivian had loved Bennett. I'm certain of this. She had been the kind of mother who had loved her sons in the specific way that women of her generation and her community were taught to love sons, which was completely and possessively and with the assumption that the loving entitled her, in perpetuity, to a particular kind of authority over the shape of their adult lives. She had loved Bennett. She had also been, for the 11 months of his illness, in a kind of slow protracted preparation for a future that did not include him in the role he had been occupying. The preparation had not made her a worse mother. It had made her a more efficient one. By the morning of the funeral, the grief had already done most of its work in her, in private, in the months when nobody had been watching her do it. The not crying was not a cold thing. It was the absence of a thing that had already been completed. I had not yet completed the absence. I was, in the kitchen, in the middle of it. She closed the door. She said, "Imogen, we need to talk about the house." I was holding a coffee cup. I set it down on the counter. I said, "Vivian, the funeral is in 2 hours." She said, "I know it is. That is precisely why I want to talk now. Before everyone arrives. Before the day gets away from us." I said, "Okay." She said, "Imogen, I want to be very clear about something. I want to be clear because I think it will be easier for both of us if we understand each other from the beginning. Bennett's father left this house to me. The house has been in this family for 122 years. It is the house my husband was born in. It is the house my sons grew up in. It is, in a way that I think you have always understood, a Holcombe house." She said, "When Bennett moved into the Carriage house with you after your wedding, he and I had an arrangement. The arrangement was that you would live there for as long as the arrangement made sense. The arrangement was not formal. The arrangement was a courtesy." She said, "I want you to know that I am extending that courtesy to you for the next 90 days. I looked at my mother-in-law. I said, "Vivian, what are you telling me?" She said, "I am telling you that I would like you to make arrangements to find a different living situation by the end of January. That gives you 90 days. I think that is more than reasonable. I am happy to provide a letter of reference if that would be helpful. I am also happy to extend, as a one-time gesture, a goodwill payment in recognition of your years with Bennett. I have spoken to my attorney. He suggested $20,000. I think that is a generous figure." She said, "I want you to know that this is not personal. I want you to know that I have always thought of you as a lovely young woman. I want you to know that Bennett's choice of you was a choice that I respected, even when it was not the choice I would have made for him." She said, "But the house is mine. The Carriage house is mine. The family house is mine. And the time has come for us to acknowledge that the arrangement was always a courtesy, and that the courtesy was always going to end at this point." She said, "I hope you understand." I stood in the kitchen of the Carriage house I had lived in for 6 years, with my husband's mother standing across the counter from me, 2 hours before my husband's funeral, and I understood several things at the same time, in the specific layered way understanding arrives when a thing has been true for a long time without being named. I understood that Vivienne had been preparing this conversation for months. I understood that the conversation had been timed, deliberately, for the morning of the funeral, because the morning of the funeral was a morning when I would be too disoriented and too grief-stricken and too overwhelmed by logistics to mount any meaningful response. I understood that the $20,000 was not a gesture of goodwill. The $20,000 was a structured payment designed to discourage me from consulting an attorney before I accepted it. I understood that Vivienne was operating from the assumption that I was, as the family had always quietly assumed, a graphic designer with limited resources and limited options and limited understanding of the legal architecture of inheritance and marital property in the state of Maine. I understood that Vivienne had not bothered, in 9 years, to find out what I actually did or what I actually had. I understood that Vivienne was wrong about almost every assumption she was operating from. I did not say any of this. I said, Vivienne, thank you for being so clear with me. I appreciate that you wanted to address this before the funeral. I will need a few weeks to think about everything you have said. We can speak again after the funeral is behind us. She said, Of course, Imogen. Of course. There is no rush. The 90 days begin today. She said, And Imogen. I said, Yes. She said, I do hope we can keep this between ourselves. Whitfield and his wife do not need to be involved. Bennett's death is hard enough for all of us without bringing in any unnecessary complications. I said, I understand. She said, Good. She opened the kitchen door. She walked back into the rest of the carriage house. I heard her speak to one of the caterers in the hallway. I heard her instruct him about the specific arrangement of the cheese plates that she wanted on the dining room table. I picked up my coffee cup. I drank what was left of it. I went to the bedroom. I put on the navy dress I had bought 8 months earlier, when the doctor had told us that the 11-month timeline he had mentioned in the spring was no longer a timeline he was confident in. I put on the pearl earrings that Bennett had given me on our 5th anniversary. I put on the small silver bracelet that had belonged to my mother. I put on the black low-heeled shoes that I had worn to my own father's funeral 17 years earlier. I went to the funeral. I stood at the front of the small church on Chestnut Street, where the Holcombe family had buried its dead for 4 generations. I shook hands with people I had never met who told me how lovely Bennett had been and how lucky he had been to have me. I sat in the front pew between Vivienne and Whitfield's wife Adelaide, a woman I had spent 9 years trying to like and who had spent 9 years tolerating me. I listened to the priest read the verses Bennett had selected for his own funeral 14 months earlier when we had begun, very carefully, to plan for the possibility that the 11-month timeline might be the timeline that mattered. I did not cry at the funeral. I had cried for 11 months. I had cried at the cot beside the bed. I had cried in the shower in the carriage house. I had cried in the parking lot of the hospital. I had cried in the car driving home from the pharmacy. I had cried in the small hours of the night when Bennett was sleeping and the morphine drip was working, and the only sound in the front room was the specific mechanical patience of the equipment that was keeping him comfortable. I had used up the crying. I sat in the pew with my hands folded in my lap, and I listened to the priest, and I thought about the conversation in the kitchen, and I thought about the woman my mother-in-law believed me to be, and I thought, very clearly, the first clear thought I had thought since the morning Bennett had died. I thought, Vivienne has no idea who I am. I thought it not as a complaint. I thought it as an observation. I thought it again. She has no idea who I am. And then I thought a second thing, and the second thing was the thing that decided everything that came next. I thought, I am going to let her find out the way she has chosen to find out. The funeral ended. The family went back to the main house for the reception. I went, too. I drank a small glass of sherry. I made polite conversation with 3 of Bennett's cousins who I had not seen in for years. I helped Adelaide with the cheese plates that Vivienne had instructed the caterer about earlier that morning. I left the reception at 4 in the afternoon. I walked across the lawn from the main house to the carriage house. I went inside. I went to the small office at the back of the carriage house where I had been running Holcombe studio for the past 6 years, in the specific quiet way that women in old New England families are expected to run their businesses when they are running them inside the property of their husbands' families. I sat at my desk. I picked up my phone. I called a woman named Wren Ashworth. Wren Ashworth was the attorney who had handled the legal structure of Holcombe Studio when I had first incorporated it 9 years earlier. She practiced in Portland. She was 45. She had become, over the 9 years of our professional relationship, something closer to a friend than to an attorney, in the specific way that women in business build relationships with the women who handle the legal architecture of their businesses. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "Imogen, I have been thinking about you all week." I said, "Wren, Vivienne came into the kitchen this morning before the funeral. She told me I have 90 days to vacate the carriage house." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Wren said, "Imogen, are you safe right now?" I said, "I am safe." She said, "Where are you?" I said, "I am in the office." "In the carriage house." She said, "Listen to me. I am driving up tomorrow morning. I will be at your door at 10. Do not have any further conversations with Vivienne or her attorney before I get there. Do not sign anything. Do not accept anything. If she comes to the door, you tell her you are still in mourning and you cannot have any conversations about the property until your own attorney has reviewed the situation. Can you do that?" I said, "I can do that." She said, "Imogen, there is something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." I said, "What?" She said, "Bennett came to see me 8 months ago. He asked me to draft something. A document. He asked me to keep it in my files until either he or you came to ask for it. He asked me not to tell you about it until you did." I sat at my desk in the small office at the back of the carriage house, and I looked out the window at the late afternoon light moving across the inlet, and I felt the specific quiet that arrives in a woman's body when she has just been told that the husband she has been mourning for 4 days had been preparing, in the months when she had not been watching, for the conversation that would happen on the morning of his funeral. I said, "Wren, what is in the document?" She said, "Imogen, we are going to talk about it tomorrow. In person. With the document in your hands." She said, "But I want you to know one thing tonight." She said, Bennett knew exactly what his mother was going to do. She said, "He prepared for it." She said, "You are going to be all right." I sat in the office. I did not cry. I did not call my mother. I did not call my sister. I did not call my best friend. I sat at the desk and I looked at the inlet and I watched the light go the specific blue it goes in coastal Maine in late October when the day is finishing and the long quiet evening is beginning. I went to bed at 9 o'clock. I slept the deepest sleep I had slept in 11 months. Wren arrived at 10 the next morning. She drove up from Portland in a blue Volvo that she had been driving for 11 years and that she insisted on continuing to drive because, she said, the car was the only object in her life she had purchased before the age of 40 that had not, in retrospect, disappointed her. I made coffee. We sat at the small kitchen table in the carriage house, by the window that faced the inlet, in the quiet morning light of a Wednesday in late October. Wren opened her briefcase. She took out a folder. She set the folder on the table. She said, "Imogen, before I open this, I want to tell you about the conversation I had with Bennett." I said, "Yes." She said, "Bennett came to my office in early March. 8 months ago. He came alone. He had not told you he was coming. He drove down on a Tuesday afternoon. He sat in the same chair you sat in when we incorporated the studio 9 years ago." She said, "He told me he was dying." She said, "He told me his oncologist had given him 11 months. He told me he had not yet told you about that specific timeline. He had told you the diagnosis was serious. He had not yet told you the specific length." I said, "Wren." She said, "I know." She said, "He told me there were things he needed to put in place that he did not want you to know about until after he was gone." She said, "I asked him why he did not want you to know." She said, "He told me that he knew his mother. He told me that his mother had been preparing, in small, careful ways, for the future that did not include him. He told me that he had been watching her conversations with the family attorney over the past year. He told me he was certain that the moment he died, his mother was going to remove you from the carriage house and from the property and from any role in the family's affairs, and she was going to do it quickly, and she was going to do it in a way that exploited your grief." She said, "He told me he wanted to make sure that when that moment arrived, you had everything you needed to handle it." I sat at the table. I did not speak immediately. I want to tell you what was happening in my body at that moment. I want to tell you because I think the moment matters more than what was in the folder. For 11 months I had been Bennett's wife. I had been the wife who slept on the cot. The wife who managed the medications. The wife who washed his face with the warm cloth on the morning of the day he died. I had been, for 11 months, the closest person to him in the world. What I had not understood, because Bennett had been careful that I should not understand it, was that for the first 3 months of his illness, before I had been told the specific length of the timeline, Bennett had been doing something else. Bennett had been preparing. He had been preparing for the version of his mother he had spent his entire life knowing. He had been preparing for the conversation in the kitchen on the morning of the funeral. He had been preparing for me. Wren saw my face. She said, "Imogen, take a moment." I took a moment. I drank some of my coffee. I said, "Wren, tell me what is in the folder." She opened it. She said, "Imogen, Bennett's father, Duncan Holcombe, did not leave the family house to Vivian." I looked at her. She said, "I want to repeat that. Because I want you to be very clear about what I am telling you. Duncan Holcombe did not leave the family house to Vivian. Duncan Holcombe left the family house to a trust. The trust was established in 2003, 2 years before his death. The trust was structured with specific provisions about the inheritance and disposition of the family house in perpetuity." She said, "The trust has 3 named trustees." She said, "The first trustee is Vivian Holcombe." She said, "The second trustee is Whitfield Holcombe." She said, "The third trustee is Bennett Holcombe." She said, "Bennett's death does not end his role in the trust. Bennett's death triggers the succession provisions of the trust. The succession provisions name a specific successor trustee for Bennett's seat." She paused. She said, "Imogen, Bennett's successor trustee is you." I sat at the table. I looked at Wren. I said, "Wren, Vivienne told me yesterday that the house was hers." Wren said, "Vivienne has been telling people the house is hers for 22 years. Vivienne has, I suspect, in the long years since Duncan's death, allowed herself to forget that the house is not hers. She has been the matriarch of the property. She has lived in the main house. She has made decisions about the property in the way that a person who owns a property makes decisions. None of the other trustees have, until now, had any reason to challenge her. She said, Bennett, I think, had begun to challenge her in private. He had begun to ask, gently, about the trust. He had been receiving answers from her that did not match the actual structure of the trust. He had become concerned. That concern, I believe, is part of what motivated him to come to my office in March. She said, he wanted to make sure that the documents were located. He wanted to make sure that the trust structure was understood. He wanted to make sure that, in the event that Vivienne attempted to use his death to consolidate control over the property, the structure of the trust would prevent her from doing so. She said, there is more. I said, tell me. She said, Imogen. The trust does not own only the family house. The trust owns the entire 3-acre property. The carriage house. The boathouse on the inlet. The small parcel of land across the road that has been undeveloped for 40 years and that has, I should mention, recently been informally evaluated by a land surveyor at a value that significantly exceeds what anyone in the family appears to have understood it to be worth. She said, the trust also holds a 10% interest in the commercial fishing operation. Whitfield runs the operation. The operation is owned by a separate corporate entity. But the trust has a non-controlling interest that generates an annual distribution. She said, the annual distribution from the fishing operation for the past 3 years has averaged approximately $240,000. I looked at her. She said, as a successor trustee, Imogen, you have an equal vote with Vivienne and Whitfield on all matters relating to the trust. You have legal access to all financial records of the trust. You have the right to participate in all decisions about the disposition of the assets held by the trust. She said, you also have a personal interest, as the surviving spouse of a trustee, in any distributions that were due to Bennett at the time of his death. She said, Bennett's distributions for the past 3 years have not been deposited into your joint accounts. They have been deposited into a separate account in his name only, that, based on the records he left with me, contains approximately $720,000. She said, the $720,000 belongs to you. She said, Bennett left it specifically for you. She said, he left a letter explaining why. She held up an envelope. The envelope had my name on it. In Bennett's handwriting. The careful, slightly slanted handwriting I had been looking at on grocery lists and birthday cards and small notes left on the kitchen counter for 9 years. She said, do you want to read it now or later? I said, now. She handed me the envelope. I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long. Bennett had written it in March. He had written it 3 days after his appointment in Wren's office. He had written it on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in the studio working on a brand identity project for a client in Portland. He wrote, Imogen. He wrote, if you are reading this, it means that one of 2 things has happened. Either I have asked Wren to give it to you because the circumstances we have been afraid of have arrived, and we have decided together that you need to know. Or I am gone. I think it is more likely the second. He wrote, I want to tell you why I have not told you what is in this letter while I am alive. Not because I have been hiding something from you. Because I have been protecting something for you. He wrote, my mother is going to try to take the carriage house from you. I have known this since I was a child. My mother believes that her son's wives are temporary arrangements. She believes that the family is the architecture and the wives are the staffing. She has believed this for as long as I have known her. She believed it when my father was alive, and she had not yet had the opportunity to act on the belief. She has believed it more, in the years since my father's death, because there has been no one to correct the belief. He wrote, "She loves me. I want you to know that I am clear about this. She has loved me my whole life. The loving has not made her capable of seeing you the way I have seen you. The loving has not made her capable of understanding that you are not starving. You are my wife. You are the person I chose. You are, in every way that has mattered for 9 years, the person I have built my adult life around." He wrote, "She has not seen this. She has chosen not to see it. The not seeing is going to translate, after I am gone, into a series of decisions she is going to make about the property and about you. I have known these decisions were coming for many years. I have prepared for them." He wrote, "Imagine. The trust is the protection. The trust has always been the protection. My father, before he died, understood my mother better than any of us realized. He did not leave the property to her. He left it to a trust that required the agreement of 3 people, 2 of whom were his sons, and 1 of whom was her, in order for any major decision about the property to be made." He wrote, "My father was not protecting the property from anyone in particular. He was simply making sure that no single person, including my mother, could make a unilateral decision about the future of the family's holdings." He wrote, "My mother has spent 22 years acting as if she has that unilateral authority. She does not. She has never had it. The trust documents make this very clear. I have been in conversation with Wren about this for the past several months. Wren has been quietly verifying the structure with the original drafting attorney, who is still alive and who is still practicing in Boston and who has been very helpful in confirming the provisions." He wrote, "Imagine. When my mother comes to you and tells you that the house is hers, do not argue with her. Do not contradict her in the moment. Take what she says with grace. Tell her you need time to think. Then go to Wren." He wrote, "Wren has everything you need. The trust documents. The succession provisions. The financial records. The list of what I have set aside for you in the separate account." He wrote, "I have set aside $720,000 in an account in my name that names you as the sole beneficiary. The account is for you. It is the accumulated distributions from the trust that I have not deposited into our joint accounts because I knew that, after I was gone, my mother was going to attempt to characterize our joint accounts as marital assets that were subject to her interpretation of how the family's resources should be allocated. The separate account is outside her reach. It is yours. You will be able to access it within 10 business days of presenting my death certificate to the bank." He wrote, "I want you to use it for whatever you need. I want you to use it for the studio. I want you to use it for whatever comes next." He wrote, "Imagine. The carriage house. I want to address the carriage house specifically. The carriage house is part of the trust property. My mother does not have the authority to evict you from the carriage house unilaterally. She would need the agreement of 2 trustees. After my death, the 2 trustees, in addition to her, are Whitfield and you. If she attempts to remove you, you have the right, as a trustee, to vote against the removal. Whitfield, I believe, will likely not engage in the conflict. He has been unwilling to engage in family conflicts for his entire life. But he will not vote against you on this. I have spoken to him." He wrote, "I have not told my brother that I am writing this letter." He wrote, "I have not told my brother that you are going to be a trustee." He wrote, "I have not told my brother any of the specifics of the conversations I have had with Wren." He wrote, "I have, however, in the past year, had a series of careful conversations with my brother about my mother. About the way she has, over the years, treated you. About the way she has spoken about you in your absence. About the way she has subtly excluded you from family decisions. He wrote, "My brother has been, in the long quiet way of men in our family, beginning to understand things he had not previously understood. He is not going to be your enemy in this, Imogen. He is going to be quiet. He is going to be reluctant. He is, possibly, going to be helpful in ways that surprise you." He wrote, "My mother is not going to be helpful." He wrote, "My mother is going to be exactly the woman you have always known her to be, with the difference that the loss of me will have removed the only check on her behavior that she has had for the past 9 years." He wrote, "You will be ready." He wrote, "I have made sure of it." He wrote, "I love you, Imogen." He wrote, "I have loved you since the afternoon at Blue Spruce Coffee Shop with the Wallace Stevens book in your hands." He wrote, "I am going to love you for whatever I have left, and I am going to love you in the structure of what I leave behind, and I am going to love you in the way the trust will protect you, and I am going to love you in the $720,000 that you are going to find in the account that you did not know existed." He signed it, Bennett. Just his first name. The way he had signed all the small notes he had left on the kitchen counter for 9 years. I read the letter twice. Then I set it down. Wren was watching me. She did not speak. I sat at the kitchen table in the carriage house, with the inlet through the window behind me, and I looked at the letter and the folder and the woman across from me who had been carrying this information for 8 months in the careful quiet of a friend who had been asked to wait until the right moment to deliver it. I said, "Wren." She said, "Yes." I said, "Bennett knew his mother." She said, "He did." I said, "He spent the last 8 months of his life preparing for the conversation she was going to have with me on the morning of his funeral." She said, "He did." I said, "He loved me that much." She said, "Yes, Imogen. He loved you that much." I cried then. For the first time since the morning he had died. I cried in the specific quiet way of a woman who had just been told, in writing, that her dead husband had loved her enough to protect her from his own mother. Wren let me cry. She did not move. She did not reach across the table. She did not say anything. She let me have the crying. When I was finished, she handed me a tissue from a small package she had taken out of her briefcase before I had begun to cry, in the specific way of an attorney who had been handling situations like this for long enough to know that the tissue was going to be needed. I said, "Wren, what do we do now?" She said, "Imogen, now we make a plan." The plan had 3 parts. Part 1 was the trust. Wren would, over the next 2 weeks, formally notify Vivienne's attorney and Whitfield of my succession to Bennett's trustee seat. The notification would be polite, formal, and accompanied by certified copies of the trust documents establishing my authority. Vivienne's attorney would, Wren predicted, push back. The pushback would not succeed. The trust documents were unambiguous. Part 2 was the inventory. Wren would request, in my capacity as a trustee, a full accounting of the trust's holdings and operations for the past 5 years. The request would be entirely within my legal rights. The request would, Wren predicted, generate a small but significant disturbance in Vivienne's understanding of the situation, because Vivienne had not, in the 22 years since Duncan's death, been required to provide any such accounting to anyone. Part 3 was the conversation. Wren said, "Imogen, at some point, Vivienne is going to come back to you to discuss what she will, by then, understand to be a different conversation than the one she had with you in the kitchen on the morning of the funeral. When she does, you are going to need to decide what you want." I said, What do I want? She said, that is the question. She said, I am not going to answer it for you. You are going to need to think about it for the next several weeks. There is no rush. The trust does not require any immediate action. The carriage house is yours to remain in. The $720,000 is yours to access. The annual distribution from the fishing operation will continue to come to you in Bennett's place. She said, what you decide to do about the relationship with Vivienne and about your role in the trust going forward is something only you can decide. She said, but I want you to think about one specific question. She said, when the dust settles and Vivienne understands the actual situation and the relationship between the two of you has finished its current rearrangement, do you want to remain part of this family or do you want to leave it? She said, there is no wrong answer. She said, Bennett did not tell you what to choose. He gave you the freedom to choose. That was the gift. I sat with the question. I sat with it for a long time. I said, Ren, I'm going to think about it. She said, take all the time you need. She finished her coffee. She closed the folder. She left it on the table for me to keep. She stood up. She put on her coat. She said, Imogen. I said, yes. She said, he was a good man. I said, I know he was. She said, he saw you the way you deserved to be seen. I said, I know. She said, that is the only thing that matters in the long run. She left. I sat at the kitchen table. I sat there for the rest of the morning. I sat there with the folder and the letter and the inlet through the window. I sat there until the late afternoon light began to change and the gold-going blue arrived, and I understood that I was going to be all right, and that I was going to take all the time I needed, and that the conversation with Vivienne, when it came back to me, was going to be a conversation that happened on my terms. The notification went out on a Wednesday morning, 15 days after the funeral. Ren handled it with the specific careful efficiency of a woman who had been preparing, for 8 months, the precise sequence of legal steps that would translate Bennett's foresight into operational reality. The notification went, simultaneously, to 3 people. To Vivienne's attorney, a man named Jonathan Pickering who had represented the Holcombe family for 31 years and who, according to Ren's quiet research, had himself been one of the original drafters of the trust documents in 2003 and who had, in the year since, allowed Vivienne to operate as if the structure of the trust had not been what he had personally drafted. To Whitfield, who received his notification at his office at the harbour where the fishing operation kept its accounting records. And to Vivienne, who received hers at the Maine house, by certified mail, at 11 in the morning on a Wednesday in early November. I was in the carriage house when Vivienne received hers. I knew she had received it because I watched her, through the window of the office at the back of the carriage house, walk across the lawn from the Maine house with the certified letter in her hand, in the specific quick angry stride of a woman who had just been told something she did not believe. She came to the carriage house door. She knocked. I let her knock 3 times before I answered. When I opened the door, Vivienne stood on the front step in her navy cardigan and her pearls, and she held up the letter, and she said, Imogen. What is this? I said, Vivienne. Come in. Have a cup of tea. She said, I do not want a cup of tea. I want to know what this is. I said, it is a letter from my attorney notifying you of my succession to Bennett's trustee seat in the family trust. It is also a request for a full accounting of the trust's holdings for the past 5 years. As a trustee, I have a fiduciary obligation to understand what is held by the trust one am now responsible for. She said, Imogen. You are not a trustee. I said, Vivienne. The trust documents are very clear. Bennett's death triggers his successor provision. His successor is named in the documents. His successor is me. She said, I do not know what you are talking about. I said, I think you do, Vivian. I think you have known for 22 years what is in those documents. I think you have been operating, for those 22 years, as if the documents do not say what they say. I think Mr. Pickering has been allowing you to do that, partly because the conflict of correcting you was not worth the disturbance to his client relationship and partly because, in the absence of any other party requesting an accounting, the technical structure of the trust did not need to be invoked. I said, I am the other party now. I said, I am invoking it. Vivienne stood on the front step. Her face did the specific thing I had been watching her face do, in small, subtle ways, for 9 years, when something in the world contradicted the version of the world she had been operating from. Her mouth tightened. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She drew her chin up by perhaps half an inch. She said, Imogen, whatever you think you have, whatever you think this trust is, I assure you that the family will not allow you to use it against us. I said, Vivian, I am not using it against the family. I am the family. I said, Bennett married me 9 years ago. We had 9 years of marriage. I have been part of this family for 9 years. The fact that you have not, in those 9 years, fully accepted me as a member of it does not change the legal fact that I was Bennett's wife, that I am his widow, and that the trust documents your husband drafted 22 years ago specifically anticipated this situation. I said, I am acting in my fiduciary capacity. I am acting in the interests of the trust. I am acting in the interests of the property that has been in this family for 122 years and that will, I sincerely hope, continue to be in this family for many more. I said, I am not your enemy, Vivian. I said, I am simply not going to be starving anymore. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, Bennett did this. I said, Bennett did do this. Yes. She said, Bennett went behind my back to prepare this. I said, Bennett spent the last 8 months of his life making sure that, when you came into the kitchen on the morning of his funeral and told me I had 90 days to vacate the carriage house, I would have what I needed to respond to you appropriately. I said, he knew you, Vivian. I said, he loved you. He also knew you. The two are not contradictory. He knew that the loving was real and that the knowing was also real, and he made his decisions based on both. She stood on the step. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times in the months since. She said, Imogen, he was protecting you from me. I said, yes. She said, he thought he needed to protect you from me. I said, he did. She said, from his own mother. I said, Vivian, your son loved you. He also understood that, after his death, you were going to attempt to remove me from a family I had been part of for 9 years. He prepared for the attempt. The preparation is what we are now standing on the front step of the carriage house discussing. She said, I would not have. She did not finish the sentence. She did not finish the sentence because she could not finish it without lying, and Vivian, for all of her flaws, was not in the habit of lying directly. She had told me, for hours after Bennett's body had been removed from the carriage house, that I had 90 days to vacate. She had told me that during the same week that her son had been buried. She had told me with a Goodwill payment of $20,000 and a letter of reference and the specific careful confidence of a woman who had been planning the conversation for months. She had done all of that. She could not now, on the front step of the same carriage house, pretend that she would not have. She said, Imogen, I said, yes. She said, I am 69 years old. I have been the head of this family for 22 years. I have made every decision about this property, every decision about every Sunday dinner, every decision about every Christmas, every decision about every wedding and funeral and graduation, for 22 years. She said, I do not know how to stop being that. I said, Vivian. I said, I am not asking you to stop. I said, I am asking you to share. She looked at me. She did not respond immediately. She had, I think, expected me to take. She had expected me to demand. She had expected me to evict her from the main house, or to challenge the operational structure, or to do any of the things that an aggrieved daughter-in-law might have done with the legal authority that Bennett had quietly placed in my hands. I had done none of those things. I had asked her to share. She said, Imogen, may I come in? I said, yes, Vivian. Come in. Have that cup of tea. She came in. We sat at the small kitchen table by the window that faced the inlet. I made tea. She put her certified letter on the table. She did not touch it after she set it down. She said, Imogen, what do you want? I said, I want what Bennett wanted. I want this family to function in a way that reflects the actual structure of what your husband left for it. I want the trust to be operated transparently. I want decisions about the property to be made by all three trustees. I want Woodfield to know what the trust holds and what it generates and what it is responsible for. I want the annual accounting to be shared with all three of us. I said, I want, when the family gathers for Sunday dinners and Christmas and the small annual things that this family does, to be a person at the table who is treated as a person at the table. I said, I do not want to manage your life. I do not want to make decisions about the main house. I do not want to take anything that your husband intended for you to have. The trust does not call for any of that, and I am not going to introduce any of that. I said, I want, going forward, to be a Holcombe in the way Bennett was a Holcombe. I said, that is what I want. She drank her tea. She did not respond for a long time. Then she said, Imogen, I have been wrong about you for 9 years. I said, yes, Vivian. She said, I have made that wrongness easier on myself by not bothering to find out who you actually were. I said, yes, Vivian. She said, Bennett told me, once, for years ago, that I had not been kind to you. I told him at the time that I had been entirely kind to you. He looked at me with the expression Bennett used when he had decided I was lying and that the lying was not worth challenging. He did not raise it again. She said, he was right. I had not been kind. I had been polite. The two are not the same thing. She said, I am sorry, Imogen. I want to tell you what I felt at that moment. I want to tell you because the feeling is the part of this story I think about most often. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel that I had won. I did not feel that I had received an apology that was sufficient to repair the 9 years of subtle quiet exclusion that I had absorbed in this family. I felt the specific quiet feeling of a woman who had just been told, by her mother-in-law, that the mother-in-law had finally seen her. The seeing was not enough. The seeing was also not nothing. The seeing was the beginning of a different relationship than the one we had been having. I said, Vivian. Thank you. I said it the way Bennett's mother had been raised to receive a thing said carefully to her. With the single appropriate word. Without minimizing it. Without expanding it. She drank the rest of her tea. She stood up. She said, I will speak to Mr. Pickering this afternoon. We will arrange the accounting. We will provide everything your attorney has requested. She said, I would like to invite you to Sunday dinner this week. At the Maine house. Whitfield and Adelaide will be there. I would like you to come as a trustee. As a member of this family. As the woman my son chose. I said, Vivian. I will come. She said, Imogen. I said, yes. She said, I miss him. I said, I know you do, Vivian. She said, thank you for being there with him at the end. She said it with the specific small breaking that women who do not break easily do when they finally break. I said, Vivian. He was my husband. There was nowhere else I would have been. She said, I know. She said, I am sorry I treated it as if it had been somewhere else. She left. I sat at the kitchen table with the 2 empty teacups and the certified letter and the inlet through the window. The relationship between Vivian and me did not become a close one in the months that followed. I want to be honest about this because I think the honesty matters. We did not become friends. We did not develop the warm, connected relationship that some daughters-in-law have with their husbands' mothers. The 9 years of the previous arrangement had created too much distance for that distance to be easily closed. But we became something else. We became 2 women who had finally, after 9 years and 1 funeral and 1 trust notification and 1 cup of tea, agreed to see each other. The seeing was the gift. The seeing was what Bennett had, in his own way, finally given to both of us. The trust began to operate in the way it had been designed to operate. Wren and Mr. Pickering communicated regularly. The annual accounting was distributed to all 3 trustees. The decisions about the property were made by consensus. Whitfield, exactly as Bennett had predicted in the letter, did not become my enemy. He became, slowly, in his own quiet way, something close to a brother. He invited me to come out on the boats once in the spring of the following year, to see the operation he had been running for 22 years and that I had never, in 9 years of marriage, been invited to see. I went. I asked good questions. I understood what he was showing me. He looked at me at the end of the morning, on the deck of the lead boat, with the wind in his face and the salt on his hands, and he said, Imogen. Bennett told me you would understand the operation. I said, did he? He said, he told me that I had been wrong about you for a long time. He told me that you saw things the rest of us did not see. He said that if anything ever happened to him, I should listen to what you saw. I said, Whitfield. I appreciate that. He said, he was a good brother. I said, he was a very good husband. We did not say anything for a long moment. Then Whitfield said, Imogen. The lobster boats. You know we have not modernized the cold storage in 14 years. I said, I have noticed. He said, I have been thinking about it for a while. I have not had anyone to talk to about it. I said, Whitfield. I would be happy to talk to you about it. We talked about it on the boat. We talked about it again at Sunday dinner the following week. We talked about it at his office a month later. The conversations turned, slowly, into a project. The project turned, eventually, into a small capital improvement to the operation that the trust funded and that produced, by the second year, a measurable increase in the operation's profitability. Whitfield and I did not become close in the way that some siblings-in-law become close. We became, however, partners. The Holcombe family began to function, for the first time in 22 years, the way Duncan Holcombe had designed it to function in 2003. It functioned with 3 trustees who shared decisions. It functioned with 3 trustees who shared information. It functioned with 3 trustees who, in the long quiet years following Bennett's death, found a way to make the family's holdings work for the family rather than for the matriarch alone. I want to tell you about Sunday dinners. I went to Sunday dinner at the Maine house every week. Vivienne hosted. Adelaide came. Whitfield came. Sometimes nieces and nephews came. The dinners were not always warm. They were always polite. Over the months, the politeness softened, in small, careful ways, into something closer to the warmth of a family that had finally accepted its arrangement. I want to tell you something specific that happened on the first Sunday in March. It was 4 months after Bennett's funeral. Vivienne had hosted the dinner. The meal had ended. Adelaide was helping with the dishes. Whitfield was in the front room with the children. I was alone in the dining room, clearing the last of the plates from the table. Vivienne came in. She stopped beside me. She said, "Imogen." I said, "Yes, Vivienne." She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Yes." She said, "I have been thinking about Bennett a great deal lately. About the kind of son he was. About the man he became. About the choices he made." She said, "I have been thinking, in particular, about the choice he made when he chose you." She said, "I want you to know that I see it now. The choice he made. I see why he made it. I see what he saw in you." She said, "I am sorry that it took me 9 years and a death to see what he saw." She said, "I am going to spend whatever years I have left treating you the way he saw you. The way he treated you. The way he wanted his family to treat you." She said, "I want you to know that." I looked at my mother-in-law in the dining room of the house that had been in her family for 122 years. I said, "Vivienne." I said, "Thank you." I said it the way I had said it on the front step of the carriage house. With the single appropriate word. She nodded. She picked up 2 of the plates from the table. She carried them into the kitchen. I followed her with the rest of the plates. We washed the dishes together. We did not speak for the rest of the cleanup. The not speaking, in that specific kitchen, was the first not speaking that had felt easy between us in 9 years. The carriage house is still mine. I still live there. The studio is still mine. I have grown the studio in the 4 years since Bennett's death. I have hired 3 additional designers. I have moved the operation into a small storefront on Bayview Street, 2 blocks from the bookshop where I first met Bennett. The studio now does work for clients all over New England and parts of Atlantic Canada. The $720,000 Bennett left me is in a small portfolio I have not touched. I am keeping it for the day, somewhere in the future, when I will know what it is for. I have not yet decided whether the day will come. The trust is running smoothly. The annual distributions are deposited into my account in Bennett's place. I am, in the operational and structural sense that matters, a Holcombe. I am, in the specific way Bennett wanted me to be, the wife who became the trustee who became the partner who became the family. I think about the morning in the kitchen often. I think about the conversation with Vivienne. The 90 days. The $20,000. The letter of reference. The specific careful confidence of a woman who had been preparing the conversation for months and who had, in her preparation, failed to prepare for the only thing that mattered, which was that her son had been preparing too. He had been preparing for her. He had been preparing for me. He had been preparing for the version of his family that could only come into existence after he was gone, after his mother had been forced to confront the structure she had been ignoring for 22 years, after I had been placed in the chair where I had always belonged. He had been preparing the family. He had loved it enough to prepare it. He had loved me enough to make sure I was ready for the part of the preparation that would happen on the morning of his funeral. The morning of the funeral was the hardest morning of my life. It was also the morning that gave me everything. The hardest mornings are sometimes the gifts. You do not know it at the time. You know it later. You know it when you sit at the kitchen table with the inlet through the window and the late afternoon light moving across the floor and the certified letter you no longer need to keep, and you understand, in the specific quiet way understanding arrives, that the man you loved had loved you back the entire time, in every room you did not know he was preparing, in every conversation you did not know he was having, in every quiet, careful 8 months of provision he was making while he was also dying. He had loved you all the way to the end. He had loved you past the end. He had loved you into the rooms that came after the end. That is the only kind of love that lasts. That is the only kind that matters.